Bé, molt bon dia. Senyor delegat del Québec a Barcelona, senyor diputat, senyores i senyors, benvinguts a l'Institut d'Estudis de l'Autogovern. Avui tenim la satisfacció que ens acompanyen dues personalitats, tant Toni Castells, exconseller d'Economia i Finances de la Generalitat, com el nostre ponent d'avui, que és el professor François Vaillancourt. Diré només 4 coses del seu extens currículum i deixaré després la paraula al professor Castells, catedràtic emèrit d'Economia i Hisenda de la Universitat de Barcelona, perquè pugui ampliar tant aquest currículum com, sobretot, destacar la importància del tema que ens tractarà. François Vaillancourt és, com he dit, professor emèrit d'Economia de la Universitat de Mont-real. Té una llarga trajectòria d'investigacions i jo destacaria sobretot una especialitat que és l'economia pública i també, segons figura el seu currículum, una qüestió sobre la qual potser algun dia demanarem que ens en parli, que és l'economia i les qüestions lingüístiques. És un bon coneixedor dels debats que tenim a casa nostra sobre el finançament. Ell recordava fa un moment que porta aproximadament des de l'any 2009 seguint l'actualitat i seguint més o menys les mateixes coses, i per això ens va semblar molt oportú poder aprofitar la seva visita a Barcelona perquè ens tractés d'aspectes que ens afecten directament, encara que siguin en relació a un país com és Canadà. Tant els aspectes de finançament com la particular situació en la que es troba aquell país en relació al seu mogut veí del sud, el president Trump. Sense més, deixo la paraula ara al professor Castells perquè pugui destacar el que ell cregui, en particular la importància.
Bé, moltes gràcies. Aventures de signe divers. Amics, per mi és un plaer estar aquí amb tots vostès per assistir a aquesta conferència i poder presentar el tema i el professor François Vaillancourt. Pour moi, François, c'est un plaisir t'accompagner dans cette conférence. Nous nous connaissons depuis longtemps. Ça veut dire que nous sommes assez vieux déjà. Je connais bien ses travaux et ses contributions et peux affirmer qu'il est un académicien prééminent dans le domaine du fédéralisme fiscal et est évidemment un grand connaisseur de la problématique du fédéralisme fiscal dans le Canada. Alors, ami François, même si déjà nous parlons en français, j'espérais que quelques jours nous pourrions nous parler en catalan, mais ça n'est pas arrivé encore. Mais puisque la conférence est en anglais, je vais continuer en anglais. Canadian federalism is particularly interesting, and it is a valuable example when analyzing territorial diversity and secessionist conflicts, for me, for 2 main reasons. First, it demonstrates how a federal system can successfully accommodate territories with markedly asymmetric national identities, not homogeneous aspirations for self-government. Second, it provides a constructive example of how a constitutional framework can be used to address a secessionist crisis through democratic principles. To begin with, Canada illustrates that when a state contains territories with clearly distinct national sentiments, applying a uniform model of decentralization is not always the most effective solution. In other words, when some regions express a stronger sense of nationhood and demand higher levels of self-government, the more reasonable approach is not to force them into the same pattern as all other regions. Instead, it is preferable to design specific tailor-made arrangements that recognize and respect their distinctiveness. This is precisely what has been done in Canada with the province of Quebec. Quebec's francophone majority and its historical identity have long shaped its political aspirations. Over time, Canada has adopted asymmetrical arrangements, special powers, linguistic protections, and differentiated constitutional treatment to accommodate Quebec's unique status within the Federation. Similar approaches have been implemented in other multinational states, such as the arrangements for Scotland within the United Kingdom or the institutional autonomy granted to Flanders in Belgium. All these cases show that customized solutions can help reduce territorial tensions and contribute to long-term institutional stability. The second lesson derived from Canada concerns the role of the Constitution when a secessionist conflict arises. A landmark example is the Supreme Court of Canada's decision of August 20, 1998, on the question of Quebec's potential secession. The court concluded that although neither the Canadian Constitution nor international treaties explicitly recognized a right to unilateral secession, a profound political crisis of this kind cannot be ignored. Instead, the Constitution must serve as a framework for dialogue and problem solving. The Court emphasized 4 guiding principles: democracy, federalism, the rule of law, and the protection of minority rights. This means that the Constitution should not be treated as a cage designed to block any possible solution, nor as a weapon to shut down political dialogue. Rather, it should be used creatively and constructively to find viable pathways to resolve the conflict within the democratic order. The Canadian approach highlights that constitutions are not static instruments. They can and must serve as tools to negotiate and mediate political tensions. Interestingly, a similar view was expressed in 2012 at the beginning of the Catalan secessionist conflict in Spain. Francisco Rubio Llorente, a respected constitutional scholar and former vice president of the Spanish Constitutional Court, known for his moderate, non-secessionist stance, argued that Spain could address the issue by authorizing a non-binding consultation under Article 92 of the Spanish Constitution. His position echoed the Canadian logic. Facing a profound political disagreement, the constitutional order should be used to facilitate democratic expression rather than to suppress it. In conclusion, Canadian federalism offers 2 essential lessons for plural and multinational states. First, asymmetry is not a weakness. It can be a pragmatic and stabilizing tool for accommodating diverse national identities. Second, during secessionist crises, constitutions should function as frameworks for negotiation rooted in democratic values, federal cooperation, legality, and respect for minorities. Together, these insights make Canada a compelling example of how complex political identities can be managed within a democratic federal system. To speak about that, particularly about the most relevant current issues of fiscal federalism in Canada, we have today among us François Vaillancourt. Professor François Vaillancourt is Emeritus Professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Montreal and a long-time researcher and fellow at Cyrano, Inter-University Research Center on Organizational Analysis. He earned his PhD in economics from Queen's University in 1978 and has taught at University de Montreal since 1976. His research expertise spans public economics, intergovernmental fiscal relations, and the economics of language policy. He has explored topics such as federalism and the distribution of governmental powers, taxation, as well as economic inequalities arising from language policy. Cher François, pour moi c'est un vrai plaisir que tu te trouves aujourd'hui parmi nous et nous tous sommes très intéressés en écouter tes paroles et tes réflexions. Professeur Vaillancourt, vous avez la parole.
Bon, gracias, merci. I'm in Spain because I was invited to a conference in Santiago de Compostela, but I thought that it would be quite nice to come to Barcelona, and so Nuria, I must admit, reacted fairly quickly, saying, of course, we'll be happy to have you. So thank you very much for facilitating this activity, Nuria, through the Institute, and thank you for the Institute, which I've never been to. But it is true that my wife and I have come to Spain numerous times, as some of you know, and we always enjoy, and we always discover something new. Tony claims I know parts of Spain better than some Catalans, but anyway, that's an empirical question. So this to me is a presentation based on exchanges. So please, if you have questions as we go through, something is not clear, just raise your hand and I'll either tell you, oh, you're right, I'm not clear, let me clarify, or I'll come into that in 2 slides and kindly wait, or whatever combination makes sense. But you know, it's very much not a formal academic lecture as far as I'm concerned. So, without further ado, determinants of arrangement, structural issues, operational issues, and concluding comments, but it's done a bit differently. So, the Canadian legal framework. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes to present the Canadian legal framework that you know what happens, and then we'll go into specific issues. I noted this interest in the symmetry, and I was also told there was an interest in what's happening with Alberta and the politics of secession, so I'll spend some time on both of these things, and then we'll end with Mr. Trump and the effect on regions. So, just background. Tiers are in the Constitution and law in Canada. Provinces are constitutional, municipalities are not. Responsibilities in the Constitution of 1867 have been expanded by provinces by court judgments in social matters, then centralized by amendments and clarified for new issues. And then there was the 1982 constitutional amendment. So there's been 2 major constitutions, if you want, 1867, 1982, amendments in between, and often court judgments that matter more than amendments. So we'll see in a moment what provinces do. On the revenue side, all general taxes are available by constitution and court judgment to central and provinces, except for customs revenue. So personal income tax, corporate income tax, value-added tax or consumption taxes are all joint fields of taxation which can be occupied freely by either level of government. Federal transfers have both constitutional and legal basis, and the debt and deficit is totally unregulated, except by self-restraint. So sometimes some provinces pass laws that say that they should be good, and then things don't go well and they stop being good. And that's about as binding a constraint as we have. So Quebec government, as I was asked to look at that, I guess, earlier on this year by the Auditor General of Quebec as a budget equilibrium rule, and you just can roll over the year that you'll reach equilibrium more or less as you wish. It's not very strong. So, decentralization, various items. Now, the Canadian tiers, provincial, central, I've mentioned. The one thing to note is that the municipalities have no constitutional existence whatsoever in Canada. Now, this is the map of Canada right now, okay? A couple of provinces to note. Completely to the left, British Columbia does not like oil pipelines or oil tankers, and there is a federal law prohibiting oil tankers in the northern waters of British Columbia. So presently you have a legal constraint. And next to British Columbia is Alberta, which loves oil and has the oil sands, and would like to have more oil go to the Pacific. It would also like to have more oil go to the Hudson Bay, which is the space of water next to Ontario and Quebec through Manitoba, and more oil go to the Atlantic through Quebec. So Alberta would like to have a bunch of pipelines. We'll come back to that later on, okay? And just for fun, because, I thought people think of a map of Canada as a settled country. This is Canada in 1897. It was very, very different. And the key point is that you see districts, then Manitoba, then districts, then district, then district, then British Columbia. The central part of Western Canada was all federal territory. It was bought from the Hudson Bay Company in 1870. So the boundaries we have now are not in stone. They finally were settled when the Nunavut, which is the green territory on top, was created in the late 1990s. So that was the last boundary change. So, questions of asymmetry, which could be of some interest to you, I thought, because this was raised by Tony. You know about the asymmetry in Spain, I won't tell you about that. There's asymmetry, say, Tanzania, Zanzibar. There's a choice of asymmetry. What's been done in Spain has created a feeling, I will dare say, of unfairness. The foral-cupo system means that the common system, autonomous communities, do feel some unfairness. In Canada, the asymmetry that Tony pointed out does not give Quebec a single extra dollar as such. It gives Quebec a larger share of the personal income tax base, 16.5% if you want to be precise, in exchange for an equivalent reduction in federal transfers. Now, what is interesting, Canada's perception of Quebec differences creates envy. That's different in a sense from unfairness. You may feel that Quebec is treated unfairly or something, but it's envy. It's not, the numbers don't show that. Well, calculations, I think, for Spain would show that the foral system does allow the Basque Country to retain a larger share of resources in its territories than if it was a common system community. This unfairness creates resentment, partly in Alberta, so we'll come back to Alberta a bit later on that. And so what is a few key points of asymmetry in Quebec? It starts in 1954 by a provincial decision to reestablish a tax, the personal income tax. Between 1942 and 1954, there were no provincial personal income tax because they had been rented out to the federal government to finance the war effort. These are called the tax rental agreements in the Canadian tax history. And these agreements were renewed in 47 and in 52, and in Quebec, 54 said, no, we are no longer interested. We want to reoccupy, not occupy, reoccupy, because it already had occupied it, a tax field. And that's the first step. And afterwards, it negotiates extra room in exchange for lesser treatments, it creates its own pension plan, And then it starts spending money on the universal prescription drug coverage, low-cost daycare, which is now something federal, own parental leave insurance, selection of economic migrants, so forth and so on. It's what's happened in the case of Quebec. But the asymmetry fundamentally is the exercise of powers by one province that all other provinces could have done also, but choose not to. Why? I don't know. That's a question of choice. Oops. Now, on the secession issue, just to get rid of that one, what's happening in Quebec, the referendum had aided with 49% in favor. Presently in the polls, we have a 30-35 support strength amongst youngest voters, amongst all voters, and some higher percentage, amongst youngest voters, although that's not so sure. Most voters support the Parti québécois in the voting intention. The next provincial election should be October 2026. The law sets out dates for election, but they can be changed, but it should be October 2026, okay? Presently, the Parti québécois is about 35% of voting intentions. The majority of people say that they will not vote for sovereignty, even though the Parti québécois has promised to hold a vote on sovereignty should it be elected in its first mandate, so therefore between October 2026 and presumably October 2030. That's a bit of a risky strategy because if people don't want the vote on secession, they may choose not to support the Parti québécois. The current government, the Coalition Avenir Québec, is running at about 15% in the polls. We do have an official of the government, doesn't have to endorse anything, but let's say that they made a couple of silly political mistakes at one point. And the most amusing one was about building or not building a bridge between the North Shore and the South Shore of Quebec City. And while they had been elected with 90 out of 125 members of the Quebec Parliament in 2022, so more than 2/3 majority, that ever since then, their support has been going down. And the odds of them winning, although I'm not a political scientist, I'm willing to say they're 1 in 20 in 2026. Okay, so there's not much chance that this will happen. In Alberta, this is new. Okay, this is new and old. So as I was mentioning, there's envy of Quebec. This province, it has more money and it gets equalization, and this envy is, I would say, the strongest in Alberta because Alberta is the richest province. So they feel they're paying too much for Quebec. One reaction has been what's called the West wants in. And this is when Mr. Harper was Prime Minister of Canada from 2005 to 2015. This was an example of the West wants in. That is, the West wants to be in power. It's always been the central provinces who have been in power, and now we Western politicians will run Canada. Good. But the other approach has been the West wants out. So, and that's been done through two things, something called the firewall. So we should build a wall around Alberta and keep Ottawa out. And there was a law passed in 2023 or early 2024, forget, that says that the Alberta government can state that a federal policy does not apply in its province if it does not like it. So, for example, if there's a climate-type policy, because Albertans don't like climate-type policies, that's imposed by the federal government, the province of Alberta could say, no, we don't like this, and therefore we forbid all provincial officials of assisting the federal government in implementing that policy. So one issue is the production of electricity with either renewable resources or non-renewable resources. And we could, under that law, the idea is that the Alberta government could direct the officials of electricity companies not to cooperate or not to respect the federal, say, regulations on, emissions of CO2 in the atmosphere or things like that. It has not been tested in court. But it's in a sense, an attempt at autonomy by building this firewall around the province. So keeping out the evil policies of the federal government by building this legal, but most legal scholars seem to think that you cannot do that. You cannot make illegal a federal law in your province while it is legal all over Canada. So that's a bit of a problem. Quebec has never tried that, as a matter of fact. That's a bit original from Alberta perspective. The other thing that Alberta is doing in terms of autonomy building is, as I pointed out, 2 referendums are gathering signatures in the summer and fall of 2025. One pro-Canada, one pro-secession. So the Alberta process is different from the Quebec one. The Quebec one was that the government would initiate a referendum. It would create a group for yes, a group for no. There would be leaders, a legal framework around it, spending restrictions, so forth and so on, and that's how you would run the campaign. Here it starts, the idea is to start by petitions, and the idea was probably to have a pro-secession petition, but interestingly enough, a pro-Canada petition group first got off the ground, and the last time I checked last week, because it's not decided yet, they had a sufficient number of signatures to hold a referendum saying we want Alberta to be part of Canada, but these signatures had not been validated by the electoral body. It takes a few weeks, but I don't think there's any problem. The other group, the pro-secession, as far as I can tell, has not yet attained the number of signatures on their petition to submit it to ask for a referendum to be held. So that's why I say vote in 2026, question mark. I don't know. Nobody knows, but I thought I would bring that to your attention. So that's on the secession front. On the, if I go back, on the asymmetry front, what Alberta is discussing is having its own revenue agency, the first line, having its own Canada pension plan, the third line, having more power in economic migrants, the next to the bottom line. These are the 3 things they're discussing. And I did not put down there, but having their own police service also, possibly. So, but again, the problem with Alberta, it talks a lot, but it doesn't do much. So Quebec has had its own pension plan since 1965. In 2000, I went to a conference in Edmonton where they were discussing the Alberta pension plan. Should we have one? This is 25 years ago. And in 2025, there's a working group discussion, should we have an Alberta pension plan? So the strength of the autonomous dimension of Alberta politics is a lot of talk, but very little de facto action. They just don't do it. They talk a lot about it. They don't do it. Quebec, as you can see, a list of things with various dates, they keep doing it. And the language law, the last version is 2024. That's what, last year. Things keep happening in Quebec along those fields. You can agree with them or not, but things keep going. Well, Alberta just talks about it. And what do the polls show for support on secession? There's a forthcoming paper in the Institute's discussion paper series where I put down all the numbers. Honestly, it's all over the map. It goes from 10% to 35% from one poll to another. I don't know enough about the polling situation in Alberta to judge the quality of the election polls. Those I understand better. I have some idea. It's about 15% maybe of support for secession from Canada. So, and when secessionist candidates have run in elections, the best they ever did was 9%. So it's not very, very strong as far as we can tell. Okay, so the responsibilities, I think we can forget about that. Just to mention that the last item in response to Trump, because I'll do various Trump things throughout the presentation, economic development in response to Trump. So I think you're all aware that Mr. Trump has said, we thought it was a joke, but it wasn't at the beginning anyway, that, oh, I'd like Canada to become the 51st state. In December 2024, the polls showed the Conservative Party of Canada winning the federal election by a margin of anywhere between 15 and 20 percentage points, depending on which poll. It was never below 15, and sometimes it was 20. And Mr. Trudeau Jr., Justin Trudeau, was the leader of the Liberal Party. I don't know if you know exactly what happened to Mr. Trudeau, but I think Tony could have done that when he was Minister of Finance. The day that the fall economic statement was to be presented in early December, the Minister of Finance at the federal level resigned and said, no, I'm not presenting the economic statement, and I think this government is not well run. So I still remember at 9 a.m. we were at home, and the news were forthcoming economic statement in 2 hours. And at 9:30 a.m. we were going to see, I think, one of our financial advisor, and there was this big headline on TV, Finance Minister resigned. I said, wait a moment. When I left home, there was a finance minister, and when I arrived here, there's none. So the whole thing collapsed. There was this empty room with a pile of documents. They were showing it on TV, nobody to present it, no finance minister for a few hours. Finally, somebody said, okay, it's presented. It was rather dramatic. And 2 weeks later, well, not 2 weeks, a month later, Mr. Trudeau left. And therefore, Mr. Carney ran to be the leader of the Liberal Party at the federal level, and he won with more than 80% of the vote. In second place was the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, who had resigned. Okay, and she's no longer part of the Liberal government. And Mr. Carney beat Mr. Poilievre. Now, the politics behind that is that Mr. Poilievre is not a person that is personally likable. He is not. His likability index is very low on an individual basis. This is not a personal judgment. These are polling results. I entirely agree with the polling results. He is a very, we would say, brittle, sort of with edges and never happy. He's never happy. Everything is bad. Canada is falling apart. This is terrible. We're going to, it's okay when you're running in opposition, but after a while, I think people like their politicians to be maybe a bit optimistic once in a while. If you listen to the same politician over 60 days and they're always saying the end of the world is going to happen tomorrow, I think that turned off some people, to be honest. And then Mr. Carney appeared, and he looked like a rational human being. He wasn't like Mr. Justin Trudeau. He was a well-known former central banker. We run the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He was a businessman, and he sort of said, I'm not in this for the money. What the job I have right now pays 10 times or something. He didn't say that, but everybody knew it. So I'll be happy to lead the Liberal Party and become Prime Minister. And so the current federal government is a minority government with 2 seats missing for a majority. So it's a quasi-majority. And no opposition party right now wants an election, so they sort of take turns. Well, they had a couple of people miss votes or don't show up or sick or something. So I just checked this morning, the last vote on the federal budget passed by 4 votes. So nobody turned code, but they sort of didn't show up. You don't need to have a majority. You don't need to have an absolute majority. You just need to have more yes than no. So if enough opposition members don't show up, you'll have more yes than no's, and that's what happened in the vote last night in Ottawa. So we now have a liberal quasi-majority facing Mr. Trump. So that's the political background, which is always hard to put down. And one of the tools that's being used to face Mr. Trump is the Economic Development Federal Law of June 2025 on major projects. And so this law, and this is a question about what's happening in federalism in Canada, Tony, it doesn't formally expand the federal powers, but it attempts to strengthen their use in going faster in economic development projects. Being able to say, well, we'll sort of go quickly on this environmental side aspect, or we'll go quickly on the permitting side. And of course, Alberta and Quebec tussle with provinces reacting, saying, wait a minute, these are our responsibilities. So that may or may not be, in the next few years, a major bone of contention between the federal and the provincial governments. It depends how it's used. The framework is there. It's so new, June 2025. It's not even 6 months. Until now, it's been used for projects that were already somehow in motion or being discussed, and that had a fair amount of provincial support. But how will it be used, say, next year? I don't know. But if you expect one fight, that would be on the major projects. Sorry. Now, this was a bit of background on who does what in Canada. Provinces do health and education, and the federal government does the rest. And what is happening, you were asking me, Tony, what's happening at the federal level? The other aspect that can cause tensions between the provinces and the federal level in the next few years in Canada is a recent set of 3 policies at the federal level in daycare, dental care, and pharmacare, all of which are not very important as such, but and all of which are Trudeau-inspired policy. So the major project is a Carney-inspired policy, so our new Prime Minister. The ones I'll mention now are Trudeau-inspired. I'm not sure how much the current federal government will want to defend them. Okay, I don't know. Again, we don't know. So daycare, Quebec, as I mentioned, had used its power to have a very low-cost daycare system, €3 per day when it was introduced for children aged 0 to 5 before they enter school. Everybody else in the rest of Canada was jealous, but one thing you have to understand, in English Canada, provinces or social policy groups in particular look to Ottawa to introduce new measures. In Quebec, a social policy group will tend to look to the Quebec government and say, can you do something about the homeless? Can you do something about this? Can you do something about that? In the rest of Canada, the natural, although the responsibilities are provincial, the natural tendency is to say Ottawa should do something. Ottawa should act. So that's a very important dichotomy. So daycare, Ottawa finally acted, passed bilateral agreements with provinces. There's a grant, blah, blah. It's coming up in 2026 for renewal because you see it starts in 2021, and so drop fees to $10 per day by 2026. Will the federal government put the money that's required to implement that in place? I don't know. But the renewal cycle is now. So that's one policy where the federal was using money to buy change by provinces, except in Quebec, where the policy was already in place. So in the case of Quebec, it simply gave $2 billion to the province and said, keep doing what you're doing. It's wonderful. So it reduced the cost to, some of it comes from Quebec are paying taxes to Ottawa, but most of it, roughly 80%, comes from outside Quebec. That was nice. Federal and dental care, just to mention, the federal is very odd. I'm mentioning this because I have some experts in federalism in the room. This is a very odd policy. It's a federal policy administered by a private insurance firm with direct payment to users in a field of health. So completely uncoordinated with the provinces, without any role for the provinces in that policy. That's an extremely odd creature in the Canadian federal system. I haven't seen that one. I don't remember ever seeing such a thing like that. So what it means, also, I said federally funded by general revenue, administered by private insurers, underlined because it's really odd. And it targets uninsured family with low middle income. So I think the cutoff is around 60,000 euros. So if you have income below that, we will pay an amount for a specific dental procedure, which may or may not be what your dentist asks you for. In general, dentists will ask a bit more. But the idea was to make dental services, which were not covered by the healthcare system before then, available at low cost to low-income families or individuals. But usually, you compare that to the daycare just before. That's done through an agreement with provinces. This one is done through direct payment. And finally, this 2024-25, this is the last Trudeau social policy innovation. So all of them in the 2021-2025, and explain why in a moment. Canadian pharmacare is under implementation. So don't ask me exactly, I don't know. I checked at the beginning of October when I was preparing this, there were agreements with 3 provinces still. Now maybe there's a 4th one that's been signed since then, I don't know. But it was not really agreed to, and this is supposed to be a block grant funding. So the agreements say, we give you, it's a very specific number down to the last dollar type thing, to provide those following medications to the residents of your province. So it's diabetes, contraception drugs, and some rare conditions. So that's closer to the daycare, closer to the traditional fiscal federalism arrangements of cost sharing with some agreements with the provinces. Again, will that be kept by the current Liberal government? I don't know. The promise is yes, but we know, most of us in the room don't believe all promises by all politicians, so I think we don't know what's going to happen there. Now, why 2021-25? Well, like in the case of Spain, we had the first Trudeau government was a majority government, 2015-2019. The second Trudeau government was a minority government, 2019-2021. And then the third Trudeau government, 2021, was again a minority government. But this one had an explicit agreement with the New Democratic Party. So Trudeau was center-left, and so the New Democratic Party is left. Let's call them left center and liberal center left. So they're a bit more to the left, okay? But they're not like the new mayor of New York, for example. It's a true socialist, or NDP are not true socialists. And so because there was this agreement with the government, they were able to push through. The daycare was already planned, but the dental care and the pharmacare are the direct result of the Liberal Federal Party being in a minority government with what we call a supply and confidence agreement with the NDP. The NDP agreed to vote with the government, but in exchange got a list of things on which those twos were. So the current Liberal government does not have a confidence supply agreement. It says, we're going to go vote by vote, and if we lose, we go to election. Okay. Own revenues, I just want to mention something which happened, and is there's no longer carbon taxation outside of Quebec. So until April 2025, there was a carbon tax in Canada, which was a federal tax was in place if a province did not have an equivalent tax. So that was the system that we had in Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada passed a judgment 2021 or 22, I forget, in early 2020s, that said this is okay. So the federal government can come and say, you must have a tax of $15, $30, $45, $60 a ton of carbon emitted. That was increasing every year. There was a target of 130. But if your tax is deemed acceptable, we don't step in, and you keep the revenue. Otherwise, the federal government came in, put in a tax, and sent back the money to the households in the provinces. So it did not keep the money. It was not a money-making machine for the federal government. It was a price-setting mechanism for the federal government with 90% compensation of revenue. Those of you who are economists in the room will think of Hicks and Stotsky compensation agreements. If you remember your microeconomics of second year, the way I used to teach it, it's exactly that. It's saying we want to make you whole in terms of revenue, but we want to change your behavior by making something costlier and the rest is less costly. That's what happened. This was a major Conservative Party policy point in 2024. The slogan was "Axe the tax." And so when Mr. Carney was elected leader of the Liberal Party, Federal Liberal Party, at the end of March 2025, he said, sure, why not? Let's axe the tax. And so we do away with one of the major electoral planks of the federal Conservative just as the election starts. So formally speaking, he did not axe the tax, he set the rate to 0. Now in this budget, he has axed the tax, okay? But for 6 months, it was just, I can't remove a tax from the law, but the law says that I set the rate, so I will set the rate to 0. So the rate is gone. But Quebec, as usual, Tony, Quebec was asymmetric. This time, we had joined California with a carbon market. Well, we're still in the carbon market. There's a 20 cents difference per liter in the price of gasoline when you cross from Quebec to Ontario. Trust me, I have a son who lives in Ottawa. I fill up in Ontario when I go to see him. I'm sorry, Monsieur le Délégué Général, that's a treacherous thing to say, but at 20 cents, at 2 cents, I will fill up in Quebec, but at 20 cents difference, I will fill up in Ontario. And so so that's one of the things that's made the current government unpopular. People drive to Ontario, they look at the price of gasoline, and they say, why is it so expensive in Quebec? Why don't you do something? And the government says, well, I'm in a carbon market, I have agreements, I'm stuck. So that's one of the very recent change in policy. Mr. Carney is being blamed for that in part because he was a pro-environmental central banker, and now what he's doing is not so much pro-environment. The other debate was an issue on the inclusion of capital gains in taxation, which was done away with. If there's questions about that, I'll answer it, but it's a boring topic. And just to give an idea of own revenues, personal income tax is 30% of all government revenue, and 40% is provincial, 60% of consumption is provincial, and corporate income tax 37%. And 18% of provincial revenues come from federal transfers, and 24% of that is federal expenditures. This is a system of transfers. The equalization in Canada is not like the Spanish one. It's only on fiscal capacity. If you have questions about that, we can come back. Just for fun, it was a formula. What's happening in the area of transfers right now that could be of interest to you? Well, there's a Newfoundland court challenge. It comes, I think it's June 2024. It argues for taking into account cost of delivery to dispersed population. So it argues in the sense to become more Spanish, because it's really only fiscal capacity in Canada right now. We do not take into account expenditure needs. We do not take into account the dispersion of population. Apart from that, there's ongoing unhappiness with equalization in Alberta and Saskatchewan. I already mentioned Alberta, Saskatchewan also. There's been suggestions that equalization should be equal per capita, which I guess is one way of defining equalization, but that's not what we really mean usually. Alberta had a referendum. Tony referred to the 1998 Supreme Court of Canada decision, and should there be a referendum, and there's a clarity law afterwards and all that. The argument that Alberta used in that referendum was, well, we're having a referendum, you should negotiate with us. And there was dead silence in Ottawa. And even though the referendum was 2/3 in favor of doing away with the clause in the Constitution that enshrines equalization, so it was an issue of constitutional power. It was just not a political issue. Complete silence in Ottawa. The thing has gone away. Nobody talks about it anymore. But just to mention, historically it happened. So the debt, our latest budget is about 2.2% deficit with respect to GDP. Okay, the federal budget. So doesn't really matter. Now, challenges: climate change, land and ocean impacts, demography, unequal aging, economic, and then Trump. This just shows Canada's this odd situation. With climate change, some of the southern lands will become less productive, but some of the northern lands will become more productive for agriculture. So I found this one paper, and that's why I put the references up there, because I'd never seen that before, to be honest, trying to prepare something of interest, that showed an increase in productive land with climate change. Oh, I said, that's not what we read in general, so it may well be different for Spain, which will just get drier and all that. Canada may have a trade-off of moving its agriculture border north in the prairies. That's one thing. This is the sea level risk. That's the same thing, I presume that Barcelona faces that kind of challenge, or Valencia. I guess Madrid is safe, like Ottawa, but we have the same issues. The darker the blue, the higher the sea will rise. So that's the issue that we face in Canada. In terms of population challenges, the key issue is the aging of the population. It's very unequal. Newfoundland, this is the share of 65-plus population in 2025. It's 24% in Newfoundland. It's 14.3% in Alberta. It's almost 2-to-1. So we have and I suspect it's the same case from autonomous communities in Spain. Some of them are aging faster than others. And so we have this issue. We do not take into account that fact in our equalization or transfer system. So that's a structural program that we have. Some demo-linguistic population, look at the top line, okay? This is the share of Francophones mother tongue observed in 2011, and from 2026 onwards, it's projected. The share of Francophone is going from 81 to 75, and I would hazard that actually this is optimistic. Not because it's designed that way, but because of recent changes. So I noted in the asymmetry there was a change in the language law in 2024. We had a surge of international migrants across all of Canada, and in Quebec, amongst other places, which are not French-speaking in general. As a consequence, Quebec has reacted by trying to tighten its language policy. So that's one challenge that it's being addressed by a very important drop in the increase of immigrants. A lot of migrants came to Canada through student visas, but really with the intent of staying, and shall we say that they did not study very much and worked a lot. And so that's one issue. Economic shock Trump, the last thing that we want to talk about. So there's two economic shocks, okay? There's the 51st, I just want to make that clear, there's the 51st state threat, if you want. That's not that clear anymore. And there's the real stuff of the tariffs, okay? So the response to one, I had a couple of numbers I didn't put in here, but just I wanted to bring out. The response to the first shock, the threat, is in a reduction in purchases of products from the USA and travel to the USA. So reduction in the products, that's difficult to measure. I must say I scratched my head a bit and tried to find some data. One area when it can be clearly observed is that in most provinces, Alberta is the exception, you have a monopoly liquor board. And so you can see what they buy. And in every province except Alberta and Saskatchewan, one does not import US liquor anymore. So looking at the exports from the US, I could find that the exports of US liquor, whiskey, whatever, vodka, wine, exactly, from California, had dropped 85%. So some associations of alcoholic beverage producers in the US are very upset, okay? And we're called nasty Canadians because of that. The US ambassador to Canada currently, I don't think understands the word diplomatic, as far as we can tell. It's refreshing in some sense, but he tends to be rather direct and say, why are you behaving this way? And we sort of say, but you know, folks, you started it, not we. So anyway, that's one thing. So the other thing is that the drop in travel, roughly 30% drop. If I look at the numbers, I didn't want to swamp you with numbers, but you see Trump is elected, and there's no change. And in February, a small drop. We count the travel re-entry from the US of Canadian citizens, okay? We have that from border law. So February, maybe a 5% drop, March at 7%, and by June, it's down by 25-30%. And I checked recently, it's still down. So fundamentally, tourism in the US by Canadian is down by 1/3. Tourism, because I use coming back by car. If I look at flying in, it doesn't drop as much, but flying in would include business people. So obviously, it's more difficult. But people, so it's probably more than that, but it's a very important drop. So American states that tend to have Canadian tourists are not very happy. What is interesting, politically speaking, is that Quebec, for example, for January to June, was 23% drop, and Alberta is 8% drop. Remember, we have some Alberta secessionists, and they tend to like America. Is there a relationship? I don't know, but that's clear. So this is response to two, as I mentioned, we remove from liquor store, governments discuss reducing purchase from US firms, federal counter tariffs were adopted, then dropped. Okay, there were federal, only China and Canada had counter tariffs to US tariffs. China still has them, we don't, but we're a bit smaller. We attempt to reduce interprovincial trade obstacles, and as I mentioned before, facilitate major projects. Now, what's the impact by province to give you an idea of what's happening? Well, we have 85 to 90%. Nobody can give me the exact number. I found 3 different sources with 3 different numbers, so I'm not sure. But I'm sure it's above 85 and not above 90. 85 to 90% of Canadian exports to the US enter the US tariff-free. Why? Because we have the Canadian-Mexican-US free trade in place until sometime in 2026. I don't know. There's a review mechanism, and I just don't know what's going to happen, but right now it's in place, and it's been in place since Trump has been in power. So there's been a lot of huff and puff, but the majority of Canadian exports enter the US tariff-free. So what is targeted? Well, aluminum has a 50% tariff. That's the silliest of all the US tariffs, because they don't have aluminum producing capacity to replace the imports. So they're increasing the price of beer cans and cars, okay? 60% of aluminum-related jobs are in Quebec. And then steel also faces a 50% tariff. There, the US have some steel-making capacity. 78% of steel-making jobs are in Ontario. So different industry happens to be the same tariff rate, just it was picked like that, but you have different regional impact. Car parts and cars face a 25% tariff, 80% for cars and 90% for car parts jobs are in Ontario. So the most vulnerable province to the existing, I didn't check this morning, but I'm going to assume existing US tariff arrangements is Ontario because of its car industry and of its steel-making industry. Quebec, and the aluminum market is more international. You can ship aluminum by ship. No, you won't get as much money maybe as you would have, but it's an international market. So we're doing reasonably well. The lowest of all the specific US tariffs, as far as I know, unless it's changed, again, I check, but not every day, is petroleum at 10%. Petroleum is 90% in Alberta. Okay, so this is it's like car parts 90% in Ontario. So we have a differentiated regional impacts of differentiated American tariffs. So it's a bit of a strange, at one point it was suggested to put an export tax on petroleum, which we did in the 1970s. There is a precedent to justify doing that. That could compensate things. So that's the Trump policy. And I think, okay, this was a slide on, this actually is not as good as the number I just gave you. And this is the modified individual behavior. And by Canadian, by nasty Canadian is sort of my last slide, because this is what happens in liquor store. It says by Canadian instead. And so, gracias, merci, thank you.
Moltes gràcies. Queda obert el debat si algú de vostès vol formular alguna pregunta o fer algun comentari.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. For me, it's a pleasure to listen to you because in my works, I've really cited your works. And I will appreciate if you could build upon a little bit on the phenomenon of race to the bottom in Canada in terms of taxes. Because here in Spain, recently we've had something which could be, from a constitutional law perspective, considered a turning point, which was that the socialist government created a wealth tax, and the Constitutional Court upheld that wealth tax. And effectively, this wealth tax was occupying the tax field of the autonomous communities that were carrying out a very aggressive race to the bottom. And I wonder, I know that, of course, the constitutional setting in Canada is more respectful to a provincial fiscal autonomy than here in Spain. But I've missed maybe that in your lecture you could have maybe more, talk a little bit more about race to the bottom, especially I imagine that in Alberta, corporate income tax, personal income tax have probably been quite reduced, and that might be triggering a race to the bottom effect in the rest of Canada. And I wonder, from a constitutional law perspective and from a constitutional politics perspective, what's the situation? Thank you.
So the wealth tax you mentioned is a national tax. It was introduced by the socialist government in Madrid, correct? Okay, good. Actually, the first time I came to Catalonia, Tony called me to his office. I don't know if he remembers that. And he says, those folks in the autonomous community in Madrid, they want to do away with the inheritance tax. But here in Catalonia, we like it, we want to keep it. What do you do in Canada? So I have the impression of being asked the same question, which is interesting. We had a succession tax until the 1st of January 1972 in Canada. It was abolished at the federal level. And we had succession or inheritance, both terms can be used, taxes in all provinces in Canada. And they were, the last abolition was in Quebec in 1988, so they were abolished in successive ways. I don't remember the exact dates, but between 72 and 88, we go from 10 to 0. So we do have a race to zero, the bottom for the succession tax. And the last province that keeps it is the province which has the less mobile population, which is the French-speaking population, which would find it more difficult to move, although you can create trust that you incorporate in other provinces to move assets away, okay? So that's on the succession tax. What we have is that when assuming a couple, when the surviving spouse dies, so say I die first, my wife dies after me, then all assets held by the surviving spouse are deemed to have been sold the day of that spouse's death. And all the capital gains are deemed to have been realized that day. And so you have your last personal income tax filing will include not only, say, your pension income, dividend income, but also all these deemed capital gains, and you will have to pay. And on one slide, I mentioned there was an issue of capital gains inclusion. The inclusion rate of capital gains in Canada almost went up, but didn't. And so it is currently half the inclusion rate. So if you have a $10,000 capital gain, you include $5,000 in your personal income tax return, either when you realize it, if you're alive, or when it's deemed to have been realized when your surviving spouse dies, and then you're taxed at your marginal income tax rate. So the highest combined federal provincial marginal income tax rate in Canada is about 53%. I think it's 52 point something. But let's say 50% for sake of calculation. So if I have a $10,000 capital gain, I pay $2,500 of taxes on that gain. The personal income tax rates in Quebec are substantially higher than those in other provinces, and they're on a larger share of the personal income tax. Very few people move because of that. Alberta had a flat tax rate from outside of Quebec, sorry, just a big background. Outside of Quebec, all taxes, all personal income tax are collected by the Canadian Revenue Agency, which, as Pepe knows, is not really an agency, but a part of the federal government. We had a discussion about that a few years ago. And the system is like Spain. That is that the provinces must set their rate, their number of brackets, the value of each bracket. So before 2000, it wasn't like that. The system was that the province set a tax as a percent of the federal tax payable. It was called tax on tax, now it's tax on income. So Quebec has smaller brackets, quicker progressivity, et cetera, et cetera. So compared to Ontario in the highest bracket, you probably easily pay 5% more and probably even 7% more of income tax. But you get more public services. You get the lowest daycare, you get the backup pharmacare system, you get the parental leave, which is more generous. People seem to be happy. So we don't really have a race to the bottom. When we look to the US, the only thing that we worry about is the corporate income tax. Oddly enough, there's some deductibility issues we don't take into account. I suspect that in the next 2 years it's going to become an issue, but see, I'm not convinced that Mr. Trump's policies, all of them, will hold very long. So I was discussing that before the seminar. Canada's overall approach to Trump. And remember, one thing to know, people often ask me, is Mark Carney, our new Prime Minister, a good person to deal with Trump? My answer is, he does not have the right training. Mr. Carney has a PhD in economics from Oxford. He doesn't have a PhD in child psychology. That's what you need to deal with Trump, in my opinion. Economic rationality will not get you very far. But does he have the right training to deal with the American political system? Probably. Because overall, I think the American political system will behave rationally over some medium-term period. In the short term, I'm unable to make predictions. But in the medium term, and we're already seeing some corrections. We're already seeing, for example, Trump suddenly said, you know what, a tariff on orange juice is not a very smart thing because we don't produce enough. So I suspect the aluminum tariff at one point is going to go away just because of that. But it somehow, so with the Canadian approach right now, I don't know if you're aware of this. Okay, our provinces are very autonomous. So the Ontario ad is September or October? Do you remember? Ontario ad that made Mr. Trump upset. September, October, end of September, early October, the province of Ontario ran an ad just before, in a big, final of the baseball season. So a lot of people are watching that. It's spliced together 5 sentences by Ronald Reagan, the god of Republicans, where Ronald Reagan promoted the joys of free trade. Mr. Trump said, this is terrible, I stopped negotiating. I will put an extra 10% tariff in Canada. He didn't do it, okay? Because they're nasty, they're not nice. Yeah, I mean, what do you do with that? So Mr. Carney said, yeah, I'm a bit sorry. Smooth, and do nothing. Just do nothing. Just remember, 85 to 90% of the exports are entering tariff-free. The only economy really being hurt, there are various businesses, some of wood producing and stuff like that, I agree. But fundamentally, the only economy that's really being hurt right now is Ontario. I mean, the Quebec economy is doing much better. Of course, we won't say that in public. We all want federal money. But the only economy really being hurt in Ontario, and we just try to keep things smooth and keep the ship steady and make it to the November 2026 elections in the US and see what happens. That's fundamentally the policy. Because we've been living, Trudeau father once referred to that as the mouse and the elephant relationship. It's a mouse living next to an elephant, and if the elephant turns around, it could easily squish the mouse. So the mouse stays very quiet and just tries to figure out what the elephant's trying to do and moves here and moves there and tries to keep the relationship as steady as we can. So that's what we're doing right now, in my interpretation of the relationship. Mr. Carney's quiet. Doesn't posture, doesn't say, just tries to keep the Canadian economy as a large but not unreasonable deficit. Okay, 2% of GDP is large, but I mean, compared to what happens in Europe, it's quite small, as a matter of fact. And that's what we're doing. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. Okay.
I have one.
Oh, but you're the chair. The chair can have as many questions as it wants.
I'd like you to abound a bit on the position of Saskatchewan against the federal government.
Saskatchewan, not Alberta.
No, not Alberta, Saskatchewan.
Okay. Who cares about Saskatchewan? Okay, Saskatchewan's a natural resource producing province, uranium, potash, some petroleum products, and wheat. The party in power, I think it's called the Heritage Party or Saskatchewan Party, I forget, is a bit similar to Alberta. I think it's a spillover policy from Alberta that says, but Saskatchewan historically was the first first province with a new democratic government in Canada in the 1950s. It was the first province to introduce Medicare. It was the first province to have a doctor's strike against the introduction of Medicare, which was, the idea was the National Health Service of Great Britain was being brought in by the New Democratic Party. And it was also historically the best financially run province because the leftist government, the last thing what they wanted to be was in a position they owed money to banks. That to them was a crime in a sense. So they always ran surpluses, even though they were leftists. It's rather, fiscally conservative leftist government was Saskatchewan. They have asked for a new equalization deal. They have not, so I mentioned Alberta. I'll come back to Alberta for a moment. Alberta has set up 2 commissions, one in 2021 and one in 2025 right now, whose report is not out yet. I would have told you about it, but it's not out, which are looking for a fair deal, a new arrangement. I mentioned the referendum. I mentioned the law saying that federal actions are illegal. Saskatchewan has kept coal-fired electricity plants, and it tends to keep them longer than the federal legislation allows. So the federal legislation, if I remember correctly, is 2030 when you should be rid of all coal-fired electricity plants. And Saskatchewan has said, we have built these plants recently. They have a useful life of X years going on further than 2030. We will not respect the federal legislation on the Clean Air Act law, okay? But that's 5 years down the road. I don't know what's going to happen. That's the strongest struggle is on this issue of the production of electricity. Oddly enough, Alberta, which has very nice flat lands and lots of winds, has taken measures to reduce, I won't say prevent, but reduce the production of wind-powered electricity. A bit like Mr. Trump does in the US by stopping offshore wind power in Alberta. They've said, oh, these wind towers, they're not nice. So we're going to make Albertans caring about aesthetics. Somebody from Quebec, that is a bit surprising without being, they've never ever, they had petroleum, they had oil sand, and then they argue aesthetics. Argue something else, I would respect you. Aesthetics is a bit odd, it's an argument. The other issue but Saskatchewan would support Alberta. I don't know if we can go back to the map for a moment. There we go. So there's Alberta right there. Right now there's one oil pipeline and one natural gas pipeline that are reasonably recent going from Alberta through British Columbia. The oil pipeline is an expansion of an old one. It was finished 2 years ago. It was taken over by the federal government in 2017 when the private sector said, we give up. We don't want to build this oil pipeline anymore. There's too many problems, constitutional, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the federal government built it. It's called the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It costs 4 or 5 times the expected budget. There was a remarkable overspending. And now there's a debate, should we build a new one? Now, I mentioned this federal law on the offshore petroleum tankers. So Alberta would like, the current pipeline is at the bottom of the map going into Vancouver. Alberta would like a pipeline at the north of the map going into Prince Rupert, which is a port right there. The current Premier of British Columbia is a New Democratic Premier, either it's a very weak majority or a very strong minority, but they don't have much, they're very endangered by the Conservatives, a few seats different. They almost lost the last election. The NDP historically is against development. In this case, the New Democratic Party of British Columbia has said yes to new hydroelectricity production, but no to a pipeline crossing from Alberta for natural gas. And you're probably aware of First Nations in Canada. There's a greater acceptance by First Nations of gas than oil pipelines for obvious reasons. A natural gas spill just evaporates in the air. So if the pipeline breaks, you lose the gas, but that's it. But maybe it kills a few birds, but I mean, there's almost no environmental impact. An oil spill, depending on where it is, it can pollute a river, it can pollute a lake, and pollute I mean, it would depend on how long it lasts. So it very much, but obviously there will be immediate visible environmental impacts. So the possibility of getting a pipeline through northern British Columbia for oil is much more difficult than getting one for natural gas. Now, if we go to Saskatchewan, we're almost to Manitoba. There's not many people who live in northern Manitoba, and there's a port called Churchill, which has been there forever, which is a money-losing port. But with global warming, the Churchill Harbor may be usable for more months throughout the year, because normally the ice blocks off the northern part of Canada. But if there's no more ice, then the distances to Europe are much smaller. So there's a debate about having a pipeline going to Churchill. My bet is that you'll get an extra gas pipeline. There's already one, there's a second one planned, you could have a third one. Gas pipelines are okay. And you may even get a gas pipeline to Quebec. We said no once before, but you could probably get one to Quebec. Oil pipelines are much more difficult, except for one thing. Presently, the oil pipeline that brings oil from Western Canada to Eastern Canada goes through Ontario, but you see below Ontario obviously are the Great Lakes in the US. It actually crosses in the US. So there's no energy autonomy in oil in Canada without going through the States. And there's a debate with the state of Michigan about that, and it's a complicated story. Now, Mr. Trump won and approved an Alberta US pipeline. Biden said no to that pipeline, so stopped it. So Obama was against it, Trump approved it, Biden stopped it, Trump too may want it again. Sorry, it gets complicated, but that's what's happening. Yeah, it's an extension, yeah, but it may or may not happen, I don't know. That's a bargaining chip with Canada and EU. So we may have a pipeline going, we already have a bunch of pipelines going south, we may have an extra pipeline going south. I don't know, that's a possibility. What is interesting is that with the, historically, what we call Western oil price was usually $10 to $15 US lower than the Texan price, because we had no access to the sea. We could only sell to the States. Since the pipeline has been open, since the capacity of the pipeline to Vancouver has tripled, I shouldn't say open, but it's a big change, the differential between the American and Canadian price has dropped. So the revenues of Alberta have increased in royalties, and the corporate income tax revenues have increased for the federal government through the production of oil. So pipelines, by allowing you access to international markets, give you international prices. We're just beginning to export liquefied natural gas. That will be the same thing for natural gas. Right now, what you have is Canadian natural gas flows south to the US, and US natural gas floats out of the US as liquefied natural gas. I think there's something like 9 or 10 liquefied natural gas facilities on the Gulf of Mexico. We have one in Canada on the West Coast. So we replace American exported gas by Canadian imported gas. So Mr. Trump oddly says enough, we don't need your oil, we don't need your gas. We export 4 million barrels a day to the US of oil. And I don't know what the equivalent is in natural gas. It's a bit, again, just wait until they figure out that if they don't have the Canadian oil, they can't export it. Now, let me add just one point. It's a minor point right now. Okay, I think I'll mention it. I wasn't sure if I would, but in the issue of First Nations depends in part on the existence of treaties or not. So if treaties were passed, so in the prairies, for example, the treaties can be deemed to be unfair and not respected, but treaties were passed saying we cede this land, we take over this land, and it's done. British Columbia never had a single treaty signed. Never. So the rights of First Nation, which are in the Constitution, are much less settled than in other parts of Canada. And we have two interesting issues that just emerged this year. The first one is transnational. What do you mean transnational? Yes. There's an American Indian band or tribe, they're not called First Nations in the States, let's call them tribe, that says, you know what? Our folks, they used to go to what's called British Columbia because there was no border. So we, as an American band, have rights in Canada. And there's a court judgment that says, yeah, maybe. The Canadian First Nations are not happy at all. Already they're fighting between themselves as to who occupied what land when and what share we should have. And now you would have American tribes saying, oh, and by the way, we used to come above the border, so we should have a share of the money too in the land. I don't know how that's going to play out. I'm just saying this is an emerging issue. 3 years ago, if I'd been here, I would not have told you about that because it wasn't happening. So that's one thing. The second thing is that in the area of Vancouver, there's been a court judgment 2 months ago, literally, okay, it's quite recent, that says, yeah, no treaty, no unceded land, therefore there's an Aboriginal presence that should be recognized, yeah, and there's built up land. There's people who have bought houses and old property title, and the judge said, this is the first level of a court, okay, first instance, the judge said, well, Aboriginal rights take precedence over existing legal owners of land, which means that the title of these houses now are under a cloud. What does it mean takes precedence? I don't know. And this is because it's a first level judgment. It's going to be appealed once and appealed a second time. Until now, the idea was that if you had, say, a 10,000 square kilometer and 2,000 square kilometers were occupied already by, quote, settlers, and then you gave the 10,000 square kilometers to an Aboriginal group, the 2,000 square were out of it, and the rest would have been theirs, but it couldn't be because somebody was there, so they kept the 8,000. Now what they're saying, in this 10,000, there's those 2,000, well, maybe they're rights, maybe you could throw them. The homeowners, this is Richmond, British Columbia, the homeowners, and so the mayor called them in and said, I don't know. But if you're trying to sell your house now, you have to declare that there is this judgment that has sort of muddied up your title, and then your title is somewhat less certain than, say, the person across the street, which is not covered by that judgment, and has a similar house. Their title there would be more certain. But maybe the title is not more certain across the street simply because there's been no judgment there. So we're having this unsettled moment in terms of what it means for land ownership, which I don't know. But the emergence of Aboriginal governments, or First Nations, or whatever you want to call them, we call them First Nations, but in an international setting you would call them Aboriginals, is not done yet, is not settled yet, and you get various arrangements across provinces right now which haven't converged to a unique model. I've looked at that a bit, and I cannot tell you what's going to happen. But I can tell you that it's seen as an obstacle to development, and within the First Nations, for example, in British Columbia, the pipeline crossed recognized First Nation land. So, okay, I come, I negotiate with you, I give you 5% of something, you're happy. But then next door there's Tony. Tony is not a recognized First Nation, and the pipeline has to go over there. And Tony says, this gentleman cannot speak for me. I am not part of his nation. I am the guardian of the tradition, and you cannot put the pipeline through my land. So we have established First Nation governments, and then we have freelancing, history-based groups arguing that they should. So you can imagine the courts sometimes. I have great respect for the court when they're stuck with that. So how do you settle this? So that is an obstacle, but it's not the same across. Newfoundland, not the Labrador part, the island part, does not have a single First Nation person. So it's completely different from British Columbia, which did not have a single treaty. So within Canada, this geographic dispersion and of the rights and of the land is very, very different.
Thank you very much. Alguna pregunta més? Doncs donem per acabar aquesta sessió. Thank you very much, François. I a la pròxima.
Yeah, a la pròxima.
A la propera.
C'est ce que vous vouliez. Ça a couvert les différents sujets. Vous m'avez surpris que la Saskatchewan. C'est quoi cet intérêt pour la Saskatchewan?
J'essaie de suivre le cas.
Oui, oui.